If you were a hyperactive kid in the 1900s with undiagnosed ADHD or potentially autism, the likelihood of you hearing the words, "you're going to hospital," probably would have been pretty high. Many of these patients that got admitted from their parents or other family members probably thought they were going in to get checked up, didn't realize that most of the time they wouldn't be leaving. Thousands of New Zealanders, this actually became reality. And to think about it now and how everything works today, it's kind of a scary thought considering what they went through. By the 1900s, New Zealand had designed quite a network of systems called institutions. They were essentially asylums to house the mentally ill. Intellectually disabled, socially disruptive, hyperactive, or they just couldn't cope on their own. All of these people were categorized into one thing: mental illness. Originally, these buildings weren't designed to be prison-like systems. They were actually designed to help people in need. A place to protect them, a place to treat them, and sometimes a place to put them when society didn't know what else to do with them. So the question is, how did New Zealand end up with so many institutions, and what really happened behind the walls? We're going to delve into it all. New Zealand's first facilities that opened were designed for lunatics, and they were incredibly primitive. In 1844, so we're going back quite a bit in time now, is when the first one opened up. It was a small wooden building attached to Wellington's Gaol. If you don't know what that word means, it's basically a prison. A similar one existed at Auckland's prison, where there was no psychiatric treatment available. People were essentially shoved into these areas to try and stop them from harming themselves or others, and they were under constant watch as well. I feel like it wasn't necessarily that these people were dangerous, but some of them genuinely weren't able to look after themselves. And as time went on, the system eventually moved away from putting these people inside prisons. And then the facilities known as asylums or institutions opened up later. In 1967 in Auckland, the faux lunatic asylum opened. Then later became known as Auckland Mental Hospital, and then famously named into Carrington Hospital, which then actually turned into a university, and they still had parts of the psychiatric wards on the actual university grounds. It's a little bit strange. Like many of these institutions as well at the time, they were deliberately placed far enough away from the city centre so that if they ever did escape, they weren't able to get to the city centre to cause a ruckus. However, I'm sure they did manage to sell it in a sense where they could live in a farmland, they could work on gardens or amongst nature. Marketing back then must have been crazy because they definitely sold the peaceful lifestyle. The philosophy at the time is what they went by. It was called moral management. Essentially, you had clean air, fresh outdoor spaces, routine, exercise, everything you need to sort of reset the brain. But what they didn't expect was the amount of people that would be admitted over time. These hospitals soon became inundated with people. They weren't just treating them. A lot of the patients actually ended up living at these facilities and calling it their home. This crossover between care and home living became one of the biggest problems throughout the institutions in New Zealand. Then in 1863, Christchurch's Sunnyside Asylum opened, which was said to be one of the biggest mental health institutions in the country at the time. The crazy thing is, at its peak, it was housing like 500 to 1,000 people, which was way more than what it could do. So the conditions at the hospital started to deteriorate. Come the 1870s, New Zealand ended up actually hiring someone called Dr. Frederick Skay, who would go around and inspect these facilities to make sure that they were up to scratch, make sure people actually were being looked after, the well-being and the buildings weren't deteriorating too much. What he found shocked him. He discovered at the time was around 783 patients spanning across the country as asylums. But the problem was they only had enough room comfortably for around 270. He noted that the Sunnyside Asylum was an old decaying building and that the men's ward was severely unkept. And apparently this continued on throughout the rest of the asylums as well, as he noted similar mistreatments going on the further he looked. Then comes Seacliff, which began construction in the 1870s, and it was to become one of New Zealand's largest, again, mental institutions in the country. This one was built in Dunedin, or just north of Dunedin, which is in the South Island. It was designed to house hundreds of patients, but the problem wasn't the institution itself this time, it was the actual building. Where it was being built was completely unstable ground, and so the foundations were moving over time, which actually created far more disastrous issues for the asylum itself later on down the road. This building became so hard to manage, not only because of the foundations basically eroding beneath them, but also the amount of patients inside. So what they did was they started building little villas in the gardens surrounding the building to put patients in, essentially so they could have their own little place and gardens to do whatever they wanted outdoors, essentially. This was Seacliffe's attempt, I guess, at going for a more humane outlook, rather than squishing people in like sardines and giving them treatments that they weren't actually needing at the time. Then we move our way to the lower North Island in Porirua, which is pretty much right near Wellington. Their hospital was getting so overloaded that they eventually had to build another institution called Porirua Hospital. This one was huge. The land it covered spanned over 1,000 acres. It was said to have its own farms, gardens, workshop, even its own cemetery, which I find it a little bit weird. Who were they burying, and did people know that they were being buried there? The reason they built it on such an expansive amount of land was that they were going for a healthy environment within a hospital. Essentially, these places, from what we can see, are becoming their own entire worlds. You go to the institution, you get this lifestyle given to you, but then the treatments that come with it aren't the lifestyle you're seeking or the treatment you're seeking. The asylum life that was once for treatment basically then becomes a lifelong home. This is where things kind of go bad. The original idea on paper was good, places to send people for treatment. However, when you start having people being sent there for epilepsy, overactiveness, hyperactiveness, just misbehavior, and people end up staying and staying and staying, these wards and facilities get overrun with people that they cannot manage anymore. So at this point in time, they've now got patients who actually should be in there for treatment, but you're now getting kids who are being admitted just because they're disobeying their parents. And then you're getting random people who are essentially being admitted because they don't have anywhere to stay. So the asylums now weren't just treating mental illnesses, they were actually trying to figure out how to get people that couldn't live independently back out into the world. But how can you do that when this has now become their home? Well, lo and behold, the early 1900s pulls around, and up to 1911, officials start to realize that this system isn't working. So they changed the law. These places could no longer be called asylums, but they had to be called mental hospitals. The word lunatic became inmate, and voluntary admission became possible. Government then also stepped in and essentially made it so that not just one building could accommodate these hundreds of people that were swarming. They essentially made sure that these places built more and more villas or little tiny homes that these newer people admitting themselves in could live in. This new ideology was essentially to separate the people with conditions who needed treatment and people who needed a place to stay. We're kind of going towards a more community aspect at this point, and in some places it genuinely might have worked. Just before the 1920s came about, these facilities started bringing in new medicines for treatments, and some of them worked. However, this is kind of where things started to blow up with controversy. 1912, an infamous hospital by the name of Tokanui opened up near Te Awamutu. This became like the Porirua and Seacliff Asylum, a major institution at the time. Patients lived in villas, worked on the hospital grounds, worked on the farm, and by the middle of the 20th century, New Zealand had 11 farm mental hospitals in action. And by the year 1953, almost 10,000 patients were inside the walls of these farms or mental hospitals across New Zealand. You had Auckland at 1,500, Sunnyside at 1,500, Porirua at around 1,300, Cherry Farm had around 1,000. And by this point, they weren't by any means small hospitals. They had become complete communities. One of the biggest villa-style asylums at the time, or mental hospitals, was known as King's Seat, which opened in 1932. One was designed completely different, and you can still visit it today. It was designed as a community aspect with homes scattered all around the grounds, and that's where different patients would reside, rather than a massive building to contain them all. But the thing is, they were so good at masking to the outside world what was going on behind the walls here that nobody really understood until decades later what truly went on. Survivors eventually started coming out explaining their experiences to do with trauma, abuse, SA, neglect, excessive medication, and treatments that they did not need going on behind the walls. One survivor by the name of Alison was only 8 years old at the time, and she described later on in life what she had to deal with. She described being mentally and physically abused, over-medicated, and placed into isolation. Subjected to ECT, which, if you don't know, is electroconvulsive therapy, essentially shocks to the brain, electric shocks. And this is kind of where things get a little bit more complicated, because the treatments that were being used by the doctors inside these facilities weren't invented by the doctors to harm people. Doctors during this period of time genuinely believed what they were doing was helping, whether that be ECT, electroconvulsive therapy, insulin coma therapy, malarial fever therapy, and many other experiments. Surprisingly, some actually became useful later on, however, many of the other ones were abandoned. But the thing is that's frustrating is that these patients never really had any power to refuse these treatments. So whether or not the doctors felt like they were helping, it didn't matter because the patients at the time saw it as abuse or saw it as ill treatment because they didn't need it or they didn't want it. It was as if the institution had complete control over the patient's will. And this is where Lake Alice enters the chat, one of the darkest chapters of New Zealand's asylum history. It opened in 1950 and was originally designed for adults, but later started building wards for adolescents and children. And this is one of the places where decades later, former patients started to come out and say what they experienced was serious abuse, serious neglect, and mistreatment. The stories included punishment, prolonged isolation, heavy abuse. The list honestly could go on, but we might have to do another video for that because some of it is pretty hectic. Once again, the Royal Commission into Abuse and Care was brought in to investigate these claims. What makes these Lake Alice claims so significant and scary is the fact that they weren't during the Victorian era asylums, but it was during the 1950s through to the 1970s. So on a timeline scale, it's pretty recent. This was around the time New Zealand had already essentially landed on the moon with modern medicine. TVs were already in the homes of pretty much every person. Yet all the while, children in these psychiatric institutions were experiencing heavy amounts of abuse. Then comes another dark part about the history that a lot of people don't want to talk about, is a lot of patients actually died on these grounds and were buried with unmarked graves. The Royal Commission has received evidence from back in the day of these unmarked graves, which were located at Tokanui, Sunnyside, Cherry Farm, and Seacliff. At the Asylum of Tokanui alone, researchers pulled up that there's around 469 unmarked graves on the site there. And down at Sunnyside in Christchurch, the situation gets even worse. There are over 700 unaccounted bodies during a 40-year period that were potentially buried on the grounds. And then years later, they actually found out that that number crossed the 1,000 mark. Like, it's just insane. And then you go down to Wellington's Porirua, and it's over 2,000 unmarked graves. Now, these just aren't numbers. These are people. They belong to a family. They had a life. Someone who had a name, and now it's just all lost underground. Thankfully, by the 1960s and 70s, the whole system was beginning to crumble under its own weight. New medicines being introduced was changing treatment, and community care with inside homes, families, bringing people in who needed the help started becoming more common. And the idea itself of locking people away from society who had mental illnesses wasn't really the way to go anymore. And slowly, one by one, these giant institutions began closing. I think Seacliff was one of the first ones in 1972. Cherry Farm, however, continued up around until the early 90s. King's Seat eventually closed its doors as well. However, then it turned into a haunted attraction, which you can go and visit today, which is really cool. We do have a video coming for that soon, so stay tuned for that. And Lake Alice closed its doors in 1999, and essentially these institutions that had existed for over 100 years amongst New Zealand's landscape were disappearing quickly. So what really happened at these institutions? Well, the truth alone is much darker than the stories suggest. These places weren't genuinely just places where someone was sent to be abused. There were genuine doctors and nurses on sites who tried their best to help. And there are records that state patients genuinely did find safety at these places, but few of them. Whether there were gardens, music, sport, work, friendships were made. But the problem was the system had a fundamental flaw. It was designed to protect people, but gave immense power to these institutions over the people they were supposed to protect. And when people passed away, they had the power to bury them in unmarked graves. And perhaps that's just the darkest lesson of the New Zealand asylum era in itself. It's not that the buildings themselves are haunted and old, it's the fact that there was a system in place that told people on the outside world these people needed to be here to get the help they needed. And people on the outside believed this was the solution. It took almost a century to understand that the institution itself could become part of the problem. If you've heard about any of these asylums before, leave your thoughts down below. What went wrong? How could things have been changed from the get-go? And if you enjoy learning about New Zealand's history and dark pasts, don't forget to chuck us a like and follow for more. See you on the next one. Cheers.